I guess that's, and so where do you take that? Where do you take this Deuteronomy passage, and where
Okay,
do you
well,
usually go from that?
if that's the foundation,
Mm.
then the apex, the other bookend, so to speak, is James 1:27, where the writer says to us, real religion, pure and undefiled religion, visits widows and orphans in their need and remains unstained by the world.
Mm-hmm.
This is a one-off passage in Scripture. It's a summary passage, and all of James chapter 1, as you know, is kind of summary statements about things James will cover in more detail as it goes on. But James 1:27 is almost a summary statement for our whole understanding of poverty. And it doesn't say pure and undefiled religion does great worship services. It doesn't say pure and undefiled religion does good evangelism. It doesn't even say pure and undefiled religion does good social action.
Mm.
It doesn't say good, pure and undefiled religion posts on Facebook about the terrible plight of people.
Yes.
It says pure and undefiled religion visits widows and orphans in their need. And that idea of pure and undefiled is kind of the gold standard religion that's 99 and 44 100% pure.
Mm-hmm.
This is what it is. Religion that has no flaw in it, no fault in it. It's not in any way defiled. It's not mixed with an impurity. The highest, best religion will be involved in visiting widows and orphans in their need. And widows and orphans, because quite bluntly, they are always the poorest of the poor. In every age, in every culture, in every society, they carry the lion's share of poverty. And part of it is simply because they don't have the strength of men. And I remember when I started teaching around poverty at Tyndale, turning on my TV one day and kind of a UN food truck was somewhere in the world, and they were throwing bread and rice and stuff out to that in itself was terrible, but they literally are off the side of the truck kind of tossing things down. And I remember at some point this woman has this little bag of rice, I assume rice, and this guy comes and takes it from her. He just wrestles it out of his arms, and it's kind of me and my family first, too bad for you.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason women and orphans or widows and orphans historically in non-developed countries, and this is a dangerous thing to say in Western society, but women and orphans lack the protection of a male. And in a developed country, that's way less significant. But they were poor because there was nobody, they couldn't work themselves, or they couldn't work in any meaningful work themselves. And so when the husband disappeared, you became a widow. When the husband disappeared, your children actually became orphans. It was the disappearance of you might mourn the loss of your mom. You would be terribly heartbroken should your mom die, but all of your economic security died when your dad or your husband disappeared. And so James doesn't just simply say, go visit the poor. He says, go visit the poorest of the poor, the widows and the orphans.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you think I'm making that up, James is picking up on an Old Testament formula. And this phrase, widows and orphans, orphans and widows, comes up just short of 100 times in the Old Testament. And it's a common phrase meant to, it was part of what later became called the quartet of the vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And it was widows, orphans, aliens, and the poor in general, as defined in Zechariah. Anyway, James says, if you want real religion, go visit widows and orphans. And he says, in their need. And what he's really kind of saying is, James is smart. He knows that if you actually are a reasonably decent person and you sit with somebody in your need, in their need, you'll be moved by their need. You actually might do something. And over the years, I've watched some of the most hard-nosed business people come through the mission, and a mom talks to them, or a little kid in our daycare grabs them by the leg, and I've kind of watched them melt. And all of a sudden, compassion that may have been laying dormant kind of springs up. And I've watched people just do incredible things because somebody actually touched them, or they actually touched somebody else.
Yeah.
And so James says, go visit, don't visit them in the sterility of your office. Go visit them in their need.
Mm.
And it took me a long time. I kind of missed this for a while. But the key word in this whole passage is visit.
Yeah.
Go be with people. And again, this comes back to, who do you visit? Well, you visit family, you visit friends. Who do you make appointments with? You make appointments with doctors and lawyers and accountants and people you don't know. But you visit family and friends. And so all of a sudden you come back to kind of Deuteronomy, where it's about embrace, it's about being with, it's about Jesus saying, or Matthew saying that Jesus is incarnate, that he is God with us, and we visit and we get to be with people.
Yes.
And we literally are back to that concept of embrace. And when you sit with people, whether you're in a South American-based community and you're sitting with people around a Bible study, or whether you're, I remember when I was first starting this, I remember a woman coming saying to me, would you do a Bible study with my friends? And as a young pastor, like, oh, that's like gold. And I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? And they said, well, tell us how to be Christian. So I arrive at this home, and you often hear about maritime kitchen parties, because we have huge kitchens, and a lot, even apartments often have huge kitchens in Atlantic Canada. And so I arrive at this kitchen, and there are 17 women there. And I've got my 4 spiritual laws, and I've got my 4 steps to peace with God, and I'm all set to tell them about what a Christian is. And as we're getting ready to do this, one of the women looks at another one of the women and says, you have a black eye. And the woman says, yeah, so-and-so hit me. And the woman who asked the question said, well, my guy hasn't hit me in weeks. And all of a sudden, this conversation started in a circle, and 15 of the 17 women there had histories of abuse. And there I sit with my 4 spiritual laws. And that's kind of, I think, what James means is, if you go and visit people in your need, or in their need, your eyes will become open. And we've since moved on. We now talk about assets and so on and so forth. But at the most base level, sit in the need. And then James takes this turn, and for years I didn't get this. He says, real religion visits widows and orphans, but remains unstained by the world. And he used to, for the life of me, not know what that unstained by the world thing meant. It was like a tag on at the end that, in my mind, kind of should have been somewhere else. Like, it just didn't make any sense that it was there. And so I remember when and this is after the fact, I went to seminary. And my seminary prof, who was teaching practice of ministry, warned us about visiting divorced women, because the class was mostly male at that point. And there was this kind of sense of, well, you know what divorced women are like.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it reminded me of when I was in Bible school, and the guys were out in their little pastorates, and they come back and they tell stories about Mrs. So-and-so, and she was divorced, and they had to be really careful, and yada, yada. And I remember I used to think, gee, like, I go visit women and none of that stuff ever happens to me. There must be something wrong with me. But what my professor was essentially saying is real religion visits widows and orphans in their need, but you watch those widows and orphans because they will hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to stay safe from them. Don't be stained by them. But fortunately, I had met this woman named Vaughn Lee. And Vaughn was a Salvation Army worker, retired, burnt out Salvation Army worker who was part of this community.
Mm-hmm.
She came to me one day and she said, Rick, before you ever came to this community, there was another guy in this community. He was very much like you. And she said, I came into the church one day and he was in his office with a little 14-year-old prostitute. And I hear him saying, if you ever decide to give it away for free, I'd like some. And she said to me, I ran him out of this community. And if I ever catch you,
Yes.
I will run you out of the community too. And what
Wow.
Von Lee was saying is real religion visits widows and orphans, but is careful not to prey on them because they've been victimized already. And it's easy to re-victimize somebody. And so you have to have a circumspectness about you in your dealing with widows and orphans. And then years later, I was at Evergreen. I'm standing in the front door of Evergreen. And I can't tell you exactly what was said, but we worked fairly hard to keep kids who were sparing change kind of maybe just a little north of the building or a little south of the building. But the truth is often they were standing right in front of Evergreen and they were sparing change. And one day this guy is sparing change and this business guy comes by him and gives him a business card. And I remember the kid comes over to me all excited and he's reading this business card and suddenly he goes from exciting to just like he dies. And he hands me the card and essentially the card says, why should I blankety blank care about you, you blankety blank blank, and get the blankety blank out of my face and go blankety blank die. And I can remember thinking, what sort of anger is there that you would actually have business cards printed up to hand out to the shelter?
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy.
And I realized there that what James was saying is real religion visits widows and orphans in their need, the poorest of the poor in their need, and remains unstained by the world in that our attitude and our worldview is different. We don't despise the poor. We don't blame the poor. We visit the poor. And unfortunately, when James says, remains unstained by the world, all the world means is society. And we've read up all these theologies about what the world is, but all the world means is the society around us. And the society around us has a view of poverty that says the poor are lazy, the poor are sinful, the poor are this or that. And they've got themselves into this mess, let them get themselves out of it. Yeah. Why we like doing the Christmas thing, because that's all about kids, and kids are, we create a little space for them, but adult poor we not so sure of. And the idea is that the weight of responsibility for poverty rests on the individual poor person. What the scripture says, and James and Deuteronomy are just the beginning of it, is that poverty is caused by forces bigger than the individual, caused by injustice, oppression, and we'll get on with that later. But and so the worldview is it's the fault of the poor, balanced with a little bit of systemic injustice. The Bible view is systemic injustice and forces bigger than the poor create poverty, and you get balanced with a little bit of personal responsibility. So real religion visits widows and orphans and quite bluntly has a different worldview than the rest of the world. And unfortunately in North America, generally speaking, the church has lined up with the world. This is the fault of the poor, as opposed to lining up with the scripture. This issue is bigger.
Mhm.
than the individual. Therefore, you better visit, you better embrace, you better welcome into your circle the widows, the orphans, and others who are poor. And just